My name is Stephen Dandina. I'm the Executive Director of UERU and Associate Provost here at Colorado State University, and we're welcoming you to the Town Hall, Reframing the Faculty Role at Research Universities. And in a moment, I'll turn it over to our co-sponsor, the College of Liberal Arts at Colorado State University. Well, I think it's probably time to do that. Ben Withers is our co-host and will moderate today's session. He is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. And for some of you will know that in a past life, Dean Withers was a member of UERU and a very active one in his former role as Associate Provost at the University of Kentucky. Ben, thank you so much for hosting this event, both for the college and for UERU, and welcome. I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. This is a wonderful opportunity to be able to collaborate with you, reconnect with you, and with Archie as well, who I met in many of those conferences that we had for the old RC. For those of you who are joining us from outside CSU, this is something we've done here in CLA for the last year. We're engaged in strategic planning, and we have brought some national experts in to talk to our faculty in our chairs about various issues on the national scene. We've had Vince Kellen, who's the CIO at University of California at San Diego. We had President Catherine Rowe from the College of William and Mary. So we had the West Coast and the East Coast, and today we got to go to the center of the continent and have Archie Holmes from the University of Texas system. So Archie, thank you so much for being here. When we talked about this, we talked about reframing faculty, and there were many different things we could have talked about. We could have talked about the future of tenure. We could have talked about contingency. We could have talked about faculty salaries, the relationship between staff and faculty across university, issues like student success. But we decided to focus on leadership because we thought that leadership was a crucial issue. Faculty leadership is going to be important in addressing all of those things. There was a recent report I'm going to post here in the chat from the Chronicle of Higher Education that talks about an AAUP report that mentions how faculty are feeling that their role on campus is being diminished. So I want to turn things over to you at this point. Tell us a little bit about your career, Archie, and how you got interested in being a faculty leader and some of the trajectory that you found yourself on.
Well, thanks, Ben, for welcoming me, and it's always good to see so many people. I've got a chance to look through the list, and lots of old colleagues that I've known from a wide variety of places. Where I would start is, reflecting on my 35 years in higher education, Ben, and I think if you had asked me when I was 18 years old whether I would ever be a faculty leader, to be perfectly honest, I would have borrowed all the money in the world and bet against that scenario. And I think a lot of what has changed over my life is my experience, the transformative experience that higher ed had for me, and wanting to make sure that that was translated to other folks. So kind of in brief, just a little bit about my background. I went to undergrad at the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm now currently a faculty member. Had no interest in being a faculty member when I started, and it was the experience in not only my engineering classes, but also my liberal arts classes. And Ben, I hope we get a chance to talk about that experience because I think it's really important, that led me to wanting to pursue a career in higher education. And that career was really focused on the idea that what could I do as a scholar, as an educator, to make the lives of people better. And I always thought about that in the most broadest sense. So it would be my students in terms of what I would do in terms of my education, my scholarship, but also in terms of the scholarship that I did impacting the world. As I went through my career, I recognized that that benefit that I saw wasn't as universally shared by all students. And I really wanted to try to figure out what could I do as a faculty member, or what could I do now and as an administrator to try to address those issues. And so, my journey has really been just trying to figure out, where do I sit? How can I best try to advance those issues, what I feel are important in terms of what higher ed provides to as wide and diverse a population as possible, not just the students who attend, but the faculty and staff who make the university their career home. So for me, faculty leadership really is about, taking taking responsibility for a lot of the things that we are able to ultimately do in terms of the education that we provide, the research that we conduct, et cetera, et cetera.
So Archie, if you would expand on that by just a little bit, tell us a little bit about your current role at Texas.
Yeah.
And in telling us that, tell us some of the things that you are seeing that faculty need to be concerned about at this point.
Yeah, so for those of you who are not familiar with the University of Texas system, I'll give you a 30-second overview. We are 13 institutions, 8 which are academic and 5 which are health institutions. Across our system, we have 243,000 students. I would say we are what I would refer to as a Hispanic serving system, in that over 40% of our students across the entire system are Hispanic. And so we have seen what I would see the demographic shifts that we talk a lot about are happening within our institutions, across all 8 of those academic institutions. And so my role is to work with the presidents, with the staff, a wonderful staff here we have in the Office of Academic Affairs, in terms of trying to advance the mission of those institutions in the areas of student success, research, community service, et cetera. And so what we see, of course, is something, just what do these demographic changes ultimately mean, and how do we make sure that our education is accessible, affordable, and obtainable by the students in the state of Texas? And so probably like a lot of other places, I think, the idea that our majority students are going to be the ones who had the same experience I did, which is I was fortunate enough to not have to work when I went to school, and I was able to focus entirely on education during my undergraduate years. We're finding that that is not as common as it used to be. We are having students who are going to be either part-time or going to need significant assistance, and we're going to need to be able to work and go to school together. And so for us, it's really trying to figure out, well, how do we make sure that we have the structures and the supports in place to take into account the lives of the students that are coming to us, and not force them to follow the structures that we actually used to have before. And I think that that's actually a really big aspect. I think the other big change I'm seeing, Ben, is in terms of the nature of who is actually educating. I mean, this is a national thing that we see across the country in terms of what is the makeup of the faculty. I'm fortunate in that I was able to secure upon graduation a tenured position. We know that those are becoming few and farther between, but the mission of the institution is still really important. At the end of the day, we want our institutions to be excellent, I would say, in the education that they provide, the research that they do, and every single member of the faculty, regardless of whether they are on the tenure track or not, we have to figure out how do we bring everybody together to have that collective conversation. I know for me personally, I was able to do more impactful research because there was some other faculty member who was there to pick up some of the teaching load that I might have had to do. And so it's a combination of us kind of working together and thinking about us as equal colleagues, even though we have different roles and different work. I think is going to be really, really important in terms of that. How do we build that, community of scholars that, is collectively advancing that mission together, even though we all have different roles and responsibilities. The last thing I would add is, what is, I would say, what is maybe not the purpose of higher education, but what is the expectation that the public has on higher ed? So, I would say that over a long period of time, there had been kind of maybe an unsaid agreement between what the public expected from higher ed and what higher ed was providing. I would say that that has changed in several ways. I think that there is more of an expectation in terms of, return on investment, for lack of a better word. I don't know what else to call it at this particular point. And I just think that there's an opportunity for us as faculty to taking a leadership role to try to reaffirm and reassign what it is that we do that is of value, and get the public to be on board with that. That is sometimes going to be a more complicated conversation. We can certainly talk more about that, but I think that that's another area that I see is what is the role of the especially the research university in the 21st century, given all the changes that I've mentioned.
If I could follow up, and before I do, I want to encourage people to put some questions in the chat, or put some observations. If you're having similar discussions about the role of faculty on your campuses, we'd like to hear about that in this venue, but also specific questions for Archie would be appreciated too. So hearing you you talk about some of these things, talking about the holistic view of students and changing student demographics and, the purpose of higher education. My question for you, Archie, is, aren't some of those the concerns of student affairs and some of them for higher level administrators? What's the role of faculty in dealing with those issues?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm probably biased a little bit by my own experience. I would say, Ben, honestly, I would not have had the career that I have and enjoyed, that I have found both personally and professionally rewarding, if it wasn't for a faculty member, during an office hour, kind of sitting down and just telling me that, maybe I could actually do this and I would actually enjoy it. I think that having that level of encouragement from the faculty, taking into interest and helping students to see what it is that they have the ability to be able to actually do from the perspective of that faculty member is just an amazingly impactful thing. I can talk about it per specific for me. I remember a story when I was a faculty member. There was a young lady who was in one of my engineering classes, and I had that similar conversation with her that I had the opportunity to do, and I found out that nobody else had that conversation with her, and I had probably assumed that it was obvious somebody else would have had that conversation with her, right? And so we need to think about what it is that we can do to try to help students see all the possibilities that are in front of them, help them build in terms of what it is that they ultimately do. And I really think that that is as much a faculty role as a student affairs role. I also think that we need to make sure that we are collaborating well with our colleagues on the student affairs side. I think especially, if I want students to be able to excel, academically as a faculty member, I also have to recognize that unless they are well personally, unless they are in safe environments, that's going to be a much harder task. And so there's an area where we can work really, really well and really, really closely, looking at the entire student, making sure that all aspects of their life as well, because we know that will lead to greater success going forward in a wide variety of different areas. I do think the faculty have a very unique perspective into that, a very unique role into that, and think about how we take that on as something that we can encourage our students to do.
And I see a lot of questions starting to come in, and I want to turn to them. But I want to ask you one follow-up question again, and that is, too often when we think about faculty leadership, I think that we think about chairs or undergraduate coordinators and deans and those. What's the role of non-line faculty leadership in this?
Yeah, and I can talk a little bit about my experience, right? Because I'm actually in one of those structural leadership positions, right? Serving as the Executive Vice Chancellor for academic affairs versus the role that I had played before as a faculty member. I would say, where I see the real difference, and I think what I have said has made me successful as more in that structural leadership position, is recognizing that the expertise comes from the faculty, and my role is not to always just dictate and say this is what it is that we should do. It's to work and to build consensus and to help build on that faculty expertise. And so, from a structural point of view, I think that you're a little more in the kind of facilitating that conversation point of view. Not using your authority to make things happen, I always have said is the best action, but I think the faculty really are the ones who are there to empower to be able to do those things, right? If a course if we are concerned about the quality of writing of our students, it's really going to be up to the faculty to decide, I can change my course, or I can change this curriculum to emphasize writing more, right? That doesn't really come successfully, in my opinion, from somebody from above saying to do this. It's from the faculty recognizing that that's an important, and having that important conversation amongst themselves to determine how it is that the best go forward. So to me, that's where the real leadership happens, is really in that area. And then those of us in these structural positions are there really to help facilitate that in some way.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think that sometimes the best form of leadership is that quiet form of leadership, the one that listens more than they talk, in order to pull in different viewpoints and to help advance their colleagues, maybe on an important department committee or a college committee, but someone who's really there moving things forward at the grassroots level. So actually, we got a lot of great questions over here. I'm going to turn to some of them right now. I'm going to start with one from Ray Black, who's just a recently tenured associate professor now here at CLA in our ethnic studies department. And he asks, Archie, you mentioned the invisible labor of minority first generation faculty. How do you encourage majority population faculty to pick up some of the culturally relevant work in a respectful manner?
So Ray, first of all, congratulations. I know that is a great, so congratulations on recently receiving tenure there at CSU. It is a hard conversation. Where I feel I have been able to do this well in my own career, where I've had to, recognize that, where I have privilege is on the gender side of things, especially in engineering, right? And so, for me, it's really is, as you were kind of pointing out, how it is that we have those folks that are in, the majority to help recognize how it is that we all need to collectively work together to address these issues. I think it's just honestly with conversation and being open and transparent about it, right? As you said, a lot of the labor that minority faculty do is invisible to a wide variety of different people. And we need to make sure that we try to make sure we understand from everybody what is the work that is ultimately needed to be done by the students, make that more visible to all sorts of people. And then have a collective conversation about how do we collectively do that together. So I don't know that I have a magic, this is the right way to be able to have that conversation. I just think that it's important that we all recognize that we play a role in being able to make sure that we do that.
Thank you, Archie. We've got a question over here in the question and answer box. I think it's from Maria Stampino, and I believe she's the UVP at the University of Miami. She writes, there seems to me that the trust between higher ed and the cultural community at large is broken. Hence, we have to explain what we do and how we offer ROL. I'm not quite sure what that is.
I think it was probably ROI.
ROI, there you go. Whether, especially here at a public institution. So you can see that too. How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the challenges that I see in this, Maria, is I think we are judging success using the easy metrics to measure, but I think that they're the wrong ones. And what I mean by that is graduation is 100% important, right? So I don't want to denigrate the idea that if students who start at our institution shouldn't graduate. We can argue whether 4-year graduations or 6-year graduations are really the right measure, but I think one of the ones that we look at is we judge the entire value of our sum in a lot of cases by what is your starting salary related to the amount of costs that you had in terms of being able to, obtain your education. I don't want to say that that's not an important metric, because that is, but I think one of the things that higher ed ultimately really does, and where I don't think we're telling our story as well, is what are we enabling students to be able to do that will serve them over a 20 or 30-year career. When I was in the engineering classroom, Marie, one of the projects I used to talk about with my students is I used to have them look back at the technology of when I was born and when I was an undergraduate and when I was a graduate student, and just show them that there was no way that I could educate them in technical skills today that was going to serve them for all of those changes that were happening out in the world, right? That what we ultimately do is we give them those broad skills, whether it's critical thinking, whether it's being able to work with diverse groups, whether it's able to communicate well, to be able to address all of those issues that will come up in the area. And I don't think that we have done as good a job of trying to measure and be able to explain to the public at large that that is one of also the values of what it is that we do, is that long-term benefit that isn't always financial that we provide out of higher ed.
To follow up on that a bit, talking about some of the long-term value, a lot of that value comes from teaching. Yep. And Andrea Purdy, who's in our languages and literatures department, she's a non-tenure track faculty in general parlance, but extremely dedicated full-time person here. She writes, how can you evaluate those faculty members who do take on teaching that researchers may need to set aside? Academia gives the impression that publishing is the end all of an educational institution. should tenure be offered for teaching faculty and not have them as adjuncts?
Yeah, that is a great question, which I'm going to partially dodge here, but let me say, let me say this. I think it's critically important, and this is something that was happening at my previous institution, where whether we want to ultimately talk about tenure in exactly the same way we do for tenure track faculty, I think that that's a different conversation. But what I don't think is we shouldn't have folks who are going on year-to-year contracts. I think it's really critically important to look at that long-term commitment. If somebody has demonstrated the ability to be able to do teaching and or service and or some other aspect really, really well, I think that the institution should make a longer term commitment to them and bring them into the governance structure in some way. I know a number of universities are looking at doing that in a wide variety of different ways. I know the UC system is doing that. I know that some of our institutions here in the Texas system are doing that, but I think that that's just actually fundamental. I think, having people always worried from year to year about whether they're going to continue to have a job is not serving our students well. It is not serving the academic community well, and we need to figure out how it is that we address that. Is tenure the right answer? I don't know, but I do think some longer term commitment is definitely part of the solution.
If I could follow up just a moment on that, I know that there are some institutions, I believe Portland State has done that, provided tenure for their teaching faculty, and certainly small liberal arts colleges provide tenure for that. Is there something unique or different from an R1, for example, that would keep us from doing that, or is it just what is it?
Well, I think so. One of the things that I added to, if I can, a little bit of a digression. So I had a young student when I was at the University of Virginia who was a regular in my office hours. And this is after I've been teaching for about 13 years or so. And she was just great. I would quiz her all the time, and I would ask her really complicated questions that we would have discussions about. And I knew that she knew the stuff. But every time I would put an exam in front of her, she would not perform well. And I don't know why, Ben, it took me 13 years to realize this, but at that point in time was when, oh, maybe I'm actually doing something here to cause her not to perform well, and it has nothing to do with her. And the reason I bring that up is then that got me into the whole idea of the scholarship of teaching and learning. I think that if we are going to look at teaching and as a scholarly activity, SOTL is one of the areas that we do that. In a lot of places, that is kind of put under the teaching area, which I think personally is a mistake. I think we need to think about that in terms of the scholarship that everybody else does. It is as rigorous as a lot of the other scholarship that we value. And so I think that if we can have that discussion about how does that scholarship of teaching and learning rise to measuring that sort of research, then I think then we can put it on par. But again, that's a faculty decision. There is nothing that I have ever seen in any tenure, promotion to tenure, that says that SOTL or scholarship of teaching and learning can't be considered research in terms of how you determine what is important for research in terms of you evaluate the faculty. To me, that is a faculty decision about whether they think that is an important area of scholarship that they want to value in their institution and want to give those promotions and tenure decisions to. So I think that that's the area where I would say that that's where I would think that it needs to ultimately come. Folks who do SOTL do really great work. They bring in grant funding, they do graduate students. A lot of it really does have a lot of similarities to the more traditional research that we currently recognize on.
So to follow up on that too, I think, because again, you're talking about the many aspects of faculty leadership here. There's a couple of questions that we received, one from Pamela Scully, I think she's UVP at Emory, and then Brent Iverson, who you may have already run into down there in Texas, right? They have what I think are related questions. So let's start with Pamela's first up here in the chat. She says, I think this might be the most important issue in higher ed right now. I am very concerned about how the place of faculty in the life and mission of universities is ever more diminishing, with key aspects that used to be considered part of education being outsourced to student life, to career centers, and to, it seems, everyone but the faculty. We know from research that the most impactful aspect that drives student flourishing is academic engagement. She continues, we have to both help faculty see their crucial role in the lives of students as mentors and intellectuals, and expect them to do that. I see that as the real challenge of higher ed landscape right now. Not a question really, but an appreciation of this conversation. Well, there is a question.
Yeah, there's a question. And Pamela, thank you for raising this. I mean, it goes back to something that somebody raised up earlier, right? If you look at the reward structure that we currently use at research universities, and you were going to assume that a faculty member was going to be a rational actor, a lot of the behavior we see is because of the way that the system rewards success, right? And I think that, again, this really comes back to, as faculty leaders, what do we feel that are the important things that we need to ensure that we do, not only to address the research agenda that we want to make sure that our fields are able to benefit from, but also the education that we provide. I guess I would posit that I think that those things bring together in a way that we don't need to think about them as separately, and that they are mutually reinforcing. But that is not what we have traditionally done. So, but I don't see that it has to only be faculty. I think that we have absolutely wonderful partners throughout the institutions, right? Whether it's in student affairs or other aspects. And so while the faculty should play what I would call a leadership role, I think it is a collaborative leadership role. I think that there is expertise in student affairs and other aspects that we as faculty can lean on, and we can make it better. So like in engineering, we talk a lot about what is the role of AI going to be, Ben, in the long term. And I would argue that what's going to be better than AI alone or a human alone is a human that knows how to work with AI together, because we're going to bring both of the expertises together to do something that is better than both. And I think that that also works in terms of supporting our students. Our faculty are going to be better if we are partnering and having those important conversations with our colleagues throughout the university who can help us build that infrastructure that we need to be able to do that. But I do agree, Pamela, that I think that we have to think about the role of the success of our students is a faculty responsibility. And I think that historically we've had situations where the role was, well, if they couldn't make it, too bad. I believe very strongly, at least here in the University of Texas system, I don't believe that we admit students who cannot be successful. I just don't think that we do it. It's up to us to give them the structure and the support that they need to ultimately be successful. And that's where, to me, four-year graduation rates get a little bit hard, because I think it does take some resources to be brought to bear to be able to graduate in 4 years. And if we use that as the measure of success, we're leaving a lot of students who can be successful in institutions on the sidelines. And I don't think that that's the right way to think about it.
And Archie, I want to come back and touch base on the student success in just a moment. Before I do, I want to make sure that we have an opportunity for Brent's question.
Sure.
Brent Iverson asks, he says, Archie, what do you think is the most important aspect of campus academic leadership that is missing, but that we need the most at this critical time?
So Brent and I go way back to my first tour at the University of Texas. So Brent, thank you for the question. I think that, when I think about what has changed about my life as a faculty member, I think that the time to be able to engage with my colleagues and to be able to learn and to be able to collectively problem solve, I think is the thing that we are most missing, Brent. I think that sometimes, a lot of cases, everything seems to be, we have to decide it immediately, and we aren't able always to be able to figure out how do we build that expertise, how do we take the time to do things well. And so, as the issues have become more complex, we need that diverse set of perspectives, those diverse set of life experiences to come together. But to be able to build that takes time, not only time for the issue that has come up, but time to build the infrastructure to support those sorts of relationships, even when there isn't an issue that needs to be brought up. And that's just not been part of the way that I've at least seen at research universities are always structured. And we just need to figure out how do we bring that back in. I tell a story to students when I talk about what I thought a faculty life would be. I always thought that I would see a flyer for a wonderful talk in the sociology department, and I would saunter over to the sociology department, in the middle of the day, and I'd go see a talk and have, conversations with colleagues, and then saunter back over to my engineering office. And that's not what happens, but there would be huge benefits if we can figure out how to build some of that into what it is that we ultimately do.
So, as I said, I wanted to come back to student success because we know that UERU and the old RC, that's why that organization was created, was to focus on undergraduate student success at research universities. And I remember going to some of those conferences and the meetings we'd have and getting so jazzed up by being around people like you and other people in your position about what we could do. And then going back to my home campus and wondering where the faculty leadership was. Did you have a similar experience, or what did you do? How could we overcome sometimes what seems to be a reluctance to talk about student success in the same language that we were using in UERU?
Yeah, I think I have been very fortunate in my career in that I've had colleagues who have had my same kind of concerns that I've been able to lean on. So, Brent and I did a lot of stuff, for example, about undergraduate education in our earlier careers. There's some wonderful colleagues that may be on here from the University of Virginia where we had similar conversations as well. I think the benefit of a national organization, Ben, like what we had, is then you're able to find those sets of colleagues across multiple institutions to be able to have that particular conversation. I think at the end of the day, it really just comes down to, how do we help unearth those folks who are being interested in having those conversations, and again, giving them time together to be able to have them. But yes, it's because it's not always part of the culture of where it is that you ultimately head back to. And, you have to get support not only within your own institution, but outside of it. And something that I have been very fortunate to be able to do over my career. The other thing I would tell folks to do is to look at organizations that focus on this, right? So I'm going to call it the old RC. Sorry, Steve, I'm not able to say the new name yet. I will get there. But being able to find those organizations, for me as an engineer, there was the American Society for Engineering Education, where we had lots of people who were really scholarly looking at engineering education, where I was able to find a home. I think you're seeing this in chemistry education, you're seeing this in physics education. I think you're starting to see in various areas that these communities are building up. And those are places where you can find a home, at least nationally, to be able to have these conversations. And so for those of you, that's what I would kind of suggest as one place to ultimately.
So to continue along those lines, thinking about faculty leadership, have you seen some successful programs either at Texas where you are now, or things that you've seen more broadly that have successfully been able to develop faculty leaders both within departments and also emerging campus leaders? And what points would you want to leave us with thinking about the day that we might be able to do on our home campuses?
Well, there's an interesting question. Sorry, I was a little distracted there. It was an interesting question, that I want to at least read in part of it, right? Because I think that this really gets a little bit to what you're bringing up, Ben, right? So the questioner basically says, it seems like all the problems we are discussing in higher ed stem from the pitfalls of capitalism. Starving adjuncts, the speed of time, i.e. the inability to spend time to think of the colleagues, the push to graduate students in 4 years when the country and our state won't invest in the infrastructure needed for that. And this person, he or she, does not see the possibility of making any of these things better without reevaluating the entire system that guides our reward structure. This is a really hard thing to do, but I think it's an important thing that we need to think about, right? And so one of the things that I would ask folks to think about related to this is, the example I always use is the New York Public Library. So I think the New York Public Library is great, but if you were building a library today, would you build it exactly like you built the New York Public Library? And I'm not sure the answer to that would be yes, because you know that the internet exists and other things exist, and you would probably think about it differently, but you would want it to be a really great thing. I think we need to do the same thing with research universities to some extent, right? If I were building a new research university today, would I build the same reward structure? Would I build it the same way that I would do if I could build it from scratch? Now, we can't do that to some extent. We're not going to tear down everything and rebuild it from scratch, but we as faculty have some ability to be able to change some of the important aspects of this. we control the curriculum in terms of what we believe that students ultimately learn. And if, and if we keep adding more and more courses into the curriculum, that's our decision to have done that. There isn't an outside body that is telling us that we need to do that as an example. We control lots of different aspects of this. And I think it's a really important way for us to think about what should be the reward structure that we ultimately put in place in order to be able to support what we feel that the university ultimately needs to be able to do to best serve the students and the public. Again, recognizing something I said at the beginning is the students coming to us are not the same students from which most of our institutions were defined for. They were defined for relatively privileged students who had the resources to be able to spend their entire time studying. That is not the student body that most of us are addressing. And so to some extent, are our systems in the right place in order to be able to address those students? So, that's not a 100% satisfactory action, but I do think we need to really think about what it is that we do in value and what is the role that everybody plays in that particular system.
Yeah, those are tough things for us to think about, especially in light of one of the comments we have here from an anonymous attendee in the question and answer part. In the anonymous attendee says, it's not a really question, it's a statement. It says, I hate to be a reductionist, but it seems like all the problems we are discussing in higher education stem from the pitfalls of capitalism. Starving adjuncts, the speeding up of time, that is the inability to spend time thinking with colleagues.
Yeah.
The push to graduate students in 4 years when the country and our states won't invest in the infrastructure needed for that. I don't see the possibility of making any of these things better without evaluating the entire system that guides our reward structures. And of course, that goes to your point of if we were to redesign the research university, could we without redesigning the system of which it's part?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's that's critical for us to think about in terms of ultimately faculty. At the end of the day, I do feel very strongly that the research mission of public higher ed is something that is probably not as well appreciated unless it's something that leads to a quick tangible result. I'm on the engineering side, so I tend to see that benefit more than somebody maybe in some other particular fields. I believe that is really, really, really important aspect of what it is that we ultimately do. But we need to think about how do we ultimately do that, and then what is the workforce that's needed that would support that particular effort.
I think that's also a good segue to my last question for you. And that is, coming from a college of liberal arts, I think that's one of our roles in a research university is to bring these kinds of questions forward.
Yep.
We don't expect that as much of folks from your home college engineering. We want you to build the bridges, but also build them in ways that, are culturally are fit within our culture. But one of the roles in liberal arts is to do exactly this kind of thing. So I want to ask you kind of selfishly, as an academic leader yourself, how has the liberal arts helped you, or what role do you see faculty of liberal arts playing on campus in this regard?
So the liberal arts is why I have chosen to make my career 35 years in higher ed. I've been fortunate enough that I have never been asked to leave. So I have been fortunate that since I started as an undergrad, I've been able to stay within higher ed. But I think a lot of that is really due to the wonderful, whether it was history courses, rhetoric courses, philosophy courses that I took as an undergrad. I tell people all the time, I am a better engineer because of the rhetoric of those courses that I took, for a lot of the reasons that you talked about, Ben, right? I may have the most brilliant idea in my head, but if I can't communicate that in a way that others can understand it and that others can then build upon that, then it's not been successful. And that's a lot about where I feel the liberal arts has been really beneficial to me, is to be able to help me not only be able to express what it is that I think in a better way, but be able to help me benefit from the experiences of others, to be able to be in those diverse communities where I can learn and I can become a better, not only engineer, but better person. I think that is just absolutely fundamental to what it is that we do. And it goes back to the ROI question and where we need to have that conversation. I think that's ultimately critical, but it's not appreciated out in the public at large. And I don't know how we make that case more strongly, but it's something that we absolutely positively, absolutely positively need to do. So for me, it's just been fundamental. I cannot, engineering was great. I love my engineering. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. But the fact that, I didn't get my wish, Ben, and only took math and science courses, and that the faculty at the University of Texas had the foresight to require me to take history classes and philosophy classes and rhetoric classes in order to get my degree was something that was really good, but I would not have chosen if somebody had given me another choice. And I would have been sorely lacking because of that if I had been left to my own devices.
I wanted to jump.
I was going
to jump in. Is that okay, Ben?
Yeah, sure.
I wanted to ask a question per that last statement about the University of Texas. But before I get to that, let me read the one that we have in the chat from Mary Wright, our colleague at Brown University. Mary asked Archie, we are rational beings, she claims, we are rational beings, but we are beings that have complex motivations for doing what we do. Beyond the reward structure, Mary asks, what are other motivational levers or ways to build a conducive faculty working environment that we should be thinking about?
I can, Mary, that's a really great question. And I can only speak for myself in part of this. I think when we think about reward structures sometimes, and maybe this is probably not what you mean, but we think about it more in terms of like status within the structure as well as monetary. I do think from my own perspective, and I've seen this in a number of situations, being cordial in terms of having that conducive working environment, telling people when they are doing a good job and being able to recognize that, I think ultimately goes to a long way, because as you said, we are complex beings and not everybody is motivated by having the highest salary or having that status. They just want to know that somebody has recognized what it is that they do and appreciates it. And so I think that we just need to build that more into what it is that we ultimately do. I just don't think we do it enough. I think that, and I was guilty of this younger in my career, right? And I probably still deal with this, right? Sometimes when I ask people to do something, I used to never tell them thank you, because my thought was, well, if I didn't think you were good enough, my view was if I didn't think you could do it, I wouldn't have asked you to do it in the first place. And so there was my thing. But I recognized that that wasn't enough, because that wasn't the motivation that was driving those folks to be able to do that. They really did want to hear that when progress was being made, that you just said thank you. And that's something I've had to learn over my course of career. So I do think we need to think about monetary, non-monetary, and all of those little things that we can do along the lines that will continue to drive people in order to be able to make those decisions so that we can have that working environment where everybody can thrive.
And selfishly, I wanted to pose a question too, if I could.
Sure.
Brent Iverson's question, and he is Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, reminded me that back when we were still allowed to visit campuses and have meetings, that we did visit the campus at Austin just a few years ago. And what was, there were many things impressive about that visit, Archie, but one of those was how a university that's so large and educates so many students and has such a productive research agenda going on, of course, is able to do so many innovative things for its undergraduate students. I'm not pandering. I'm thinking about signature courses and the flags in the common curriculum program, and notable faculty, it seems, across campus in disciplines like mathematics and others that are really engaged with undergraduate students. Chemistry is another that was highlighted nationally, as people will recall, a few years ago. But it's really across the institution. There's a real commitment, it seems, on the part of the faculty to the education of the undergraduate student, and a lot of innovation in terms of how to figure out how to scale their engagement with a lot of students. Could you maybe, I think it's fair, there you are in Austin, it's fair to maybe talk about that example as one way of a big, large institution like here at Colorado State or there at Texas, engaging those undergraduates in scale, but yet with this really transformative kind of forms of engagement. So, Brent, I'm going to ask you if I get some of the facts of all of this wrong, if you could put something in the chat. But you mentioned, Steve, what you're mentioning is a task force that Brent and I had the pleasure of serving on back many, many years ago
where the idea of signature courses, the ideas of the flags, and the ideas of all the stuff that you're talking about, we proposed. It really came down to, I believe, it was a kind of an august group of alumni came to the institution and basically said, for lack of a better word, you need to do better. And we assembled a faculty group from across the institution, as you said, chemists, mathematicians. I happen to be an engineer. We were led by the late Bill Powers, who was the law dean at the time and ultimately became the president, where we did actually have the time to sit down and rethink, what can we do about education at the institution, again, given some constraints. And we have some important constraints in Texas that are worth mentioning. There's a 30-hour core curriculum that we don't have a lot of control over, right? That it's articulated across the entire state, right? So if you're thinking about 120 credits, 30 of them are kind of already accounted for. I mean, you can look at what courses that you offer at your institution in that area, but a student can take those courses elsewhere and be able to transfer those in. Sorry, somebody told me 42 hours. Sorry. So it's even worse than what I thought. Thank you, Hillary. But those are the things that we kind of talked about are exactly what you talked about, right? Is when you are at 50,000 or 40,000 undergraduate students, what is it that you can do? And I think the flags were one that I think is a really great example, because it was an opportunity for the institution. So there's like a writing flag, there's an independent inquiry flag. Brent, I'm not going to remember them all, I apologize, but there's a number of them, where the faculty basically said, these topics are so important that we want courses that we know focus fundamentally on ensuring that our students are able to do these better. And we feel so important about them that we're going to call them out in a way, and we're going to make sure that every student, we can quantify that they have taken these particular courses. And I do think that that was something that, again, it was a group of faculty who came up with that idea, but we were, again, given the space, we were given the time and the resources to be able to have that conversation and come to a collective decision. My previous institution, the University of Virginia, has also done something similar in their College of Arts and Sciences, where over the last, I think, 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I'm sorry, I'm losing track on time here, but they also looked at the whole entire undergraduate experience in terms of what their core curriculum looks like. And it was all faculty led. And what I really liked about seeing that from afar, because I was in the provost office at the time, I think it was very much data driven. I think they gave everybody an opportunity to be able to tell all perspectives. So not everybody thought it was the right answer, but they had those debates, they had those important conversations in a very constructive way, and they were able to do something that I think is really great, which is to advance a different perspective on the way that general education at the University of Virginia will impact something like 70 to 75% of the undergraduates there who happen to be in the College of Arts and Sciences. And those are just 2 examples of when we give the faculty the time and the space to be able to get together. I think that there are enormous things that we can do, even when we are at constraints in terms of size, in terms of government regulations, et cetera. And it's just, we need to figure out, and maybe Ben, going back to the structural leadership, that's maybe one of the things that we do as structural leaders. We try to figure out how do we provide the resources and the time for folks to be able to have those conversations so that they can do it in a productive way. And that maybe that's where we can play a role differently than what I had said before.
That makes sense to me. Steve, did you have any follow-up questions? I know that Archie's got a hard stop up here coming up.
We have just maybe 5 more minutes to go. I wasn't going to follow up on that other than to thank Archie and Brent and Hillary for that, Texas perspective. It's an exemplary institution, and that's part of what UERU is about. Is we want to learn from each other and see where innovation's occurring. But I think Archie's main point there was you got to give the faculty or the leaders, and if they have the right resources and the space and the time, then they can do great things. And of course, we know that.
So why don't we give Archie an opportunity to wrap things up? If there's any concluding words, any things that you'd like to share here at the end of our conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. You were very generous in the things that you shared. Any final words you want to leave us with?
Maybe simply it's in our hands. I mean, those of us who happen to be in structural leadership positions, we can help facilitate that. But I think a lot of the things that we are talking about, not everything is in our hands, but a lot of it is in our hands. And we have to be able to, take control. And I really want to talk about, and I can't now remember who the professor was who raised the thing about tenure for non-tenure track faculty. I really do want to come back to that. I do think that that's something that we really do need to think about. Is there is a lot of really, really outstanding scholarship that happens in the area of teaching and learning. I would recommend highly that my colleagues who are not versed in those fields to look at that research. It really is quite amazing. And then ask yourself the question, well, if that is the type of scholarship that looks as quality as I think that it looks like, what does that warrant in terms of the way that we set up our evaluation structures? Or what it is that we expect in terms of the teaching that happens, right? Maybe is that we need to raise the level and expect those sorts of evidence-based practices that come out of the SOTL world to be more used because they have been demonstrated to be more equitably shared and lead to more equitable outcomes for a diverse student population.
Yeah, Archie, I agree. I agree with you. I think, if we're going to reaffirm the centrality of faculty in the university, we have to reaffirm that responsibility that we have to lead those discussions. It's, two sides of the same coin. So we're ending here at this time. I want to thank you so much, Archie, for the ability to reconnect with you, for your willingness to share with us again. And I want to thank Liz and Mariah, and especially Beth Etter, who's our Director of Communications in CLA. Thank all the CLA folks. I see a lot of names I recognize in there. Thank you for being here in this discussion. And I want to thank you, Steve, for making this kind of collaboration possible. It's so great to have UERU on this campus so that we can have these kinds of things happen here at CSU. And I will say, Archie, he did put the pronunciation of UERU over in the chat.
I know, I saw that. I did see that. I will get there, Steve. I will get there.
Well,
and the way I think about it, compare it to NASPA or APLU. If you think about the texture and flavor of UERU, it's got a lot more umami in it than some of these other things. So it helps you think about it. Okay, Steve, I've made my bad joke for the day. I'll turn it over.
Well, and for those who don't know, Dr. Holmes is a member of the board of UERU. So we're working on educating our board members about the new name change, which they approved. Yes, so on behalf of those nearly 100 university members of UERU, it's my pleasure to thank both Archie Holmes, who's, to remind you all, the Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the University of Texas System, and my esteemed colleague and good friend, Dean Ben Withers of the College of Liberal Arts here at Colorado State University, the home of UERU. I want to thank you both for this wonderful town hall and the over 120 participants who've come and posed questions and shared this hour with us. And let me also remind you, this is part of a series. We will post very soon our first iteration at the UERU website featuring Dr. Michael Denon of the University of California, Irvine, and as will this town hall be posted soon once it's been captioned. Maybe a few days, give us a little chance to do that, and then alert you to the last in the series, which occurs on September 28th at the same time, noon Mountain Time, featuring Dr. Jennifer Brown of the University of California, Riverside, who will be talking to us about leading strategic change in undergraduate education. We invite you for that as well. So again, on behalf of UERU and my colleagues here at Colorado State University, we thank you all.